What we're going to do is we're going to start at the very beginning. So not the Big Bang, but what I want to do is take you right back to how the ancient Egyptians conceived the beginning of the world. They thought that the god Atum stood on the primordial mound in the waters of chaos and then created the world. And he created the world with something called Heka, which is magic. There was a god called Heka as well. So let's hope there's something of the magical, the Heka, with us here tonight as we have our discussion. They thought that humanity was created by the gods with magic, therefore there must be something magical within the human being, and they called that soul. In a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to travel through the underworld with Anna, who was a scribe in 13th century Egypt, and we know a lot about him because of his Book of the Dead. We're going to go through the caverns, we're going to meet the monsters. If you're a bit scared, I'll hold your hand. We're going to be okay. But first of all, a bit more about me. I'm a journalist in my day job and I write for fun in my spare time. So this is my first book. I do the breakfast show on BBC Radio Kent. I've been up since 3:30 this morning, so if my eyes start going cross-eyed, it's not some kind of Egyptian curse like from the pharaohs or something. I'm just really tired. But I've always written and I've always loved writing. And I used to live not too far away from here. I was so lucky. I lived on Great Ormond Street. And of course, that's very near the British Museum, which is free. And when you're a journalist, you don't make a lot of money. That was a great place to go. I loved the ancient Egyptian section. I think like a lot of people, it held for me a lot of mystique, magic, of course. I'd look at the mummies all kind of bound up in their resin, and I'd look at the maps to the underworld, and I'd wonder, and I'd conjure. And I guess that started to come through in my writing, and I started to wonder about what do they put in the canopic jars? What organs do they take out? What did they think happened to the soul after you died? And I found out something really interesting, which is that for the ancient Egyptians, the idea of soul was just so different to how we fathom it. So different. I'll tell you all about it tonight, but it's almost like you have to take your brain out and put a different one in to kind of understand it. But it also led me to ask some questions, because my novel's about love and it's about relationships, and I wanted to know what's the spiritual side of keeping a relationship together. I mean, we know what happens materialistically. You know, you get married, you move into a house, you maybe have children, you maybe don't, you maybe get a car, you maybe go on holidays. There's all that stuff going on one level. But what about two people who are growing, who are figuring things out? How do you heal that if it gets broken? And does it matter if you have a soul within that equation? So that's where I'm coming from in terms of the book. So what do we think a soul is now? I think that's a really good place to start. So I've got the dictionary definition for you. It is the spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal regarded as immortal, is the first thing. It's interesting they put animal in there as well, isn't it? It is a person's moral or emotional sort of gauge or sense of identity. And finally, it's emotional or intellectual energy or intensity, especially as revealed in maybe a work of art or a performance or something like that. I wanted to know what people now think of soul, so the best way to do it was to ask some of my colleagues. Now, bearing in mind, these are all hard-nosed journalists from BBC Radio Kent and other establishments, I thought it'd be really interesting to see what they made of it. This is one of my favourites, Emily's. She got really carried away. She spent the whole of yesterday evening doing this. So you can see about the swirls and stuff, something that's inside the body. We'll come back to that. Rose, who reads the news on BBC Radio Kent, did this one. Sorry, you can't see very well over there. I'll just wave it up. You can see there's an angel and a devil. It's very much from Western thought, isn't that? Our very sort of Christian conception of heaven and hell after we die. Some people decided to write some words. I'm going to attribute this to my grandma, who's written this one for me tonight. She says, a soul is similar to a heart with misty edges. I think it's really poetic. The soul sometimes functions in the early hours, making you wonder why you did certain things, although there's nothing you can do to alter the past. This is my deputy editor. Very efficient. He does the rotas, you can tell, can't you? He says it's exclusive, individual feelings, emotions, incomplete without another soulmate, which is interesting in terms of my book and how I've tried to talk about soul within the relationship of two different people. He says it's unspoken, non-verbal communication. This is Debbie. She works in accounts. I think your soul is the inner being. It is who you are. It's your thoughts, your conscience. I believe it's the part of you that won't die, and it's the part of you that reaches out to God. Of course, I had to ask my husband, who's here tonight. I like this. No words, but a lot of energy, a lot of feeling going into the soul there. Very similar to Stephen at work, actually. He's done a man surrounded by the same sort of wiggly lines, and he says energy at the bottom. This is a very long one, so I won't read you it all, but he's basically said it's a black box of every person. Don't you think that's really great? You know, like you get a black box on an aeroplane, so it records everything throughout your life. And finally, Annabelle had a lot of fun. She says it's a vaporous energy, and she's used words like memories, hopes, regrets, personality, which is key, we'll come back to that, the unconscious mind, dreams, aura, and hopes. So as you can see, people nowadays do have an idea of soul, but it's very different to what the ancient Egyptians believed, as I said. So before we go into the 9 parts that made up the soul for the ancient Egyptians, we need to know what happened when you died. Because again, that was very different. I'm going to tell you now the story of Annie. We're going to go with him. We know his story because he had a Book of the Dead, and it's in the British Museum, actually. It's been there since 1888. He was a scribe. He worked in Thebes in the 13th century CBE. And when he died, it's very sad. But it wasn't all over for Annie, because he had this 78-foot papyrus, which was supposed to help him to reach immortality. It all hinged on this Book of the Dead. When he died, he was mummified. You probably know about that. I was quite surprised, though, to find out it's a long old process. 2 months for all the priests to take all of the organs out except the heart. And that's interesting, because they thought the heart was the seat of emotion, intelligence, and memory. I mean, essentially, I think they attributed a lot of things that we think the brain does to the heart. In fact, as I understand it, they didn't know what the brain was for. It's like, why have you got this jelly in your head, this like soggy mass? What's that for? And I guess that's because you feel things deeply, don't you, with your heart? So they thought, well, that must be where you think as well. So the heart was left in. They stuffed Annie with natron, which is a kind of salt, to preserve him, and then they wrapped him in a kind of resin-soaked linen all the way around, and they put charms within that as well. Again, this is supposed to help him in the afterlife. And crucially, there was a heart scarab amulet that sat on top of the heart. Now, don't forget that, because that's going to become quite important for Annie as he goes on his journey. So hopefully now his body is preserved. It's in its ideal form to eventually reunite with his spirit, which he's sort of going to depart from. But first, and this is the scary bit, so if you do want to reach out, that's fine, because we've got to go through the underworld. We're going to go through vast caverns. There's going to be lakes of fire, and there's going to be magical gates as well. Snakes, crocodiles, monsters, including half-human monstrosities. My favourite is called He Who Dances in Blood. It really is quite scary. And if that wasn't enough, there is Apep, who's the serpent god of destruction, and he's lurking, and he's waiting to swallow your soul. But don't worry too much about Annie, because what he's got is his Book of the Dead. Now, that is a series of spells, prayers, codes, everything you might need in the afterlife to kind of traverse this very murky, this very, very scary world. He does that. Yes, come on, Annie. And he arrives in the Hall of Mart, the goddess of truth and justice. But it's not over, because this is tricky. He has got to talk to 42 assessor gods. This is like confession 42 times over if you come from the Catholic Church. He needs to talk to each and every one, tell them their name, and tell them a sin he has not confessed. I didn't do it, mate, it wasn't me. So it's called a Declaration of Independence. And in Annie's case, he says, I have, and I swear on my life, I've never made anyone cry, I've never polluted the waters, and I've never eavesdropped. Please don't ask me again. Remember the heart scarab amulet that he had? Now this becomes really important now, because the inscription on that is, do not stand as a witness against me. Oh, no, don't you remember that time, you know, when you listened to your neighbours or whatever, and there was that point where you dipped your tootsies into the Nile, I saw you. It's like, shut up, heart, shut up, I want to get through this stage onto the next one. Fortunately, as far as we know from the Book of the Dead anyway, the heart scarab amulet works, and he gets through. But now comes the ultimate test for an ancient Egyptian, and I think this is really lovely, so I wrote about this in my book. When you get to the god, what's his name, Anubis, down there, right, then you have to weigh your heart against a feather, an ostrich feather. If your heart is heavier than the feather, it's not looking good for you because your heart is weighed down with all the sins that you've committed in this lifetime. But if your heart is lighter than the feather, it's happy days. So you can imagine a moment of absolute tension. Annie is stood there, the heart goes on, the feather's balancing, there's not many things lighter than a feather. Everyone holds their breath, but it's all right because he is deemed pure. And it's really actually quite crucial because if he wasn't, there's this creature called Amit, and he is half crocodile, half leopard or lion, and half hippopotamus. Now, if your heart is thrown to him because it fails the test, it gets eaten and you die forever. That's it. So for an ancient Egyptian, you essentially could die twice. But as I said, it's all good news for Annie. He's clean as a whistle, and he goes off with Ra, the sun god, who takes him to the underworld, to Osiris, where he gets his final approval, stamping the passport, yes, you've made it. You get to go to the field of reeds. And this was heaven, as we would conceive it in the Western notion. And it's really nice because he's reunited with the deceased. He meets his parents again. It's not an easy ride, though, because he does have to tend the fields. He's prepared because in his coffin he had a Shapti doll, and the doll's going to help him do all that work. And as far as we know, that's where he is now, you know, for all eternity, in the field of reeds. And you can read about that, as I said, in the British Museum. So that's the death part. Let's come on to the soul part. Now, as I said, it's complicated. What I did when I wrote about it in the book, I sort of simplified it, because I sort of had to, because it's really complex. So what I want to do is read you how I describe it in the book, and I describe it via a professor of Egyptology. So in the crux and the heat of the moment, the two main characters they really need some information about what the ancient Egyptians believed, because they think it's going to be crucial to moving forward and to saving their lives, essentially. So this is the point where they're sat in her study at Blackfriars College in Oxford, and she says, right, okay, I'm going to tell you how it is. And she says, the Egyptian conception of soul is much more complex than ours. Esme pulls her feet up, still sitting cross-legged, her eyes wide and her hands moving to illustrate her words. It's trilateral. That is, it's in three parts. The ba, the ka, and the ak. She coughs. Actually, their whole idea of a person was split more than ours. So the heart, the shadow, and the name were all separate, and yet part of the identity too. A bit like a Russian doll. The bits fit inside to make a person. The web of lines in Lisa's face contracts slightly, and Esme continues, we use the word soul when we're translating, but it doesn't really work. It's not the same as the modern Western notion. As I said, it's three parts. Imagine the ka as the life force, the spirit in terms of desire and food. The ak correlates to the mind and the intellect. The ba, well, that's the bit that's a bit more akin to the soul as we would understand it. It's the personality. It's what makes a person unique, and it's the part of you that lives on after death. So as I said, that's the kind of very, very crude synopsis. The 9 parts then, I've mentioned some of them just there. Heart, shadow, name, body, personality, the vital essence, the immortal self, the judge and spiritual body, and my favourite, the life energy. So I'm just going to whiz, I'm not going to go into major detail, but I'll whiz through them all so that you can get an idea of how it all fits together. And then we'll talk about how that relates to what people believe now. So let's start with the obvious, the body. It was called the kat, or the ka. That was, of course, the vessel. We've talked about mummification and how that worked. They brought it offerings. And you've probably seen these when you've seen kind of like Egyptian tombs and things like this. And you think, well, that's no good. That's going to rot and go off. And, you know, that bread's not going to last. But it was magical. So you kind of imbued like the spirit, the essence of the goods that you were left instead. The heart. We learnt a bit about this because it was just weighed, wasn't it, with Annie on the scales. I like the fact that they say the heart, or the ib, was formed with 1 drop of blood from the mother at conception. It was a seat of emotion, thought, will, and intention, as I said. And it was obviously really, really important to the ancient Egyptians because some of their words correlate. So, out-ib, probably pronounced that wrong, but there you go, means happiness. And that is actually literally translated as wideness of the heart. And za'ib is estranged, so that's truncated of the heart. And I suppose we do it too, don't we? We talk about someone being hard-hearted or mean-hearted or big-hearted. And yeah, that was examined by Anubis. this is possibly one of my favourites as well. The ancient Egyptians, and this is really sweet, thought that the shadow was part of you. I mean, it's always there, like it must be part of your body, it must be. And they called statues and little sort of figures and figurines and things shadows as well, because they mocked up the person that they represented. And some of the pharaohs had a shadow box that they would keep their shadow in, which I also think is quite nice. It was called the shoot. The Wren. Your name was really important for the ancient Egyptians. I don't know if anyone here uses a nickname instead of their given name, their true name, but a lot of ancient Egyptians did that because they thought, my true name is between me and the gods and I'm going to preserve that. Of course, the other thing you could do is to make sure everybody knew about it, really shout about it, because the more your name was out there, the more likely it was that you would live on for eternity. So, you know, obviously the pharaohs would carve it into stone and things like that. But then you got the people, the detractors, who didn't like them and hacked their names out. So you might see that in places too. Although sometimes, to be fair, that was just economy. There's a new person in, you know, let's just chip away and we'll put his name in its place. That was called the Wren. And similar to the Book of the Dead, there was a Book of Breathings, and the name in there was mentioned with a cartouche around it, a magical rope, which I think is quite nice. Now, you've heard of these, we just talked about them. The ka is the vital essence, and I think the best way to kind of translate that, how we would understand it, is your spirit. It's really nice. It was made by the god Kum on a potter's wheel. It was inserted into the mother, and then just before you were born, a god breathed life into it. So it came alive just there and then. That was the one that's sustained by food and drink, and sometimes you would see in the tombs a soul house. They'd put the food and drink for the ka inside the soul house, which was kind of useful because it gave us an idea of what the ancient Egyptians' houses might have looked like. Coming on to the ba. Now, this is the personality, as I mentioned. This is the one that's the human-headed bird. It's actually the one I focus on most in my book, because I loved the idea that this gets to travel between worlds. Sometimes, occasionally, it might do it while you're still alive, but mostly it was when you're dead. So in the daytime, it would travel up, a bit like they believe the sun travelled up, Ra, the god, and down into the underworld at night to be renewed and re-energised in the underworld with Osiris, who we met. They thought the soul did the same thing, so it went up and it came down at night, and then it was re-energised and it rejoined with the body. I can read you this. It's from the tomb of Paheri, who was an 18th dynasty monarch of Necton, if I've pronounced that right. And this is to explain the bar. It might just make it a bit clearer, and this is from the time, so it's nice. It says, your life happening again, without your bar being kept away from your divine corpse, with your bar being together with the Ak, we'll come on to, you shall emerge each day and return each evening. A lamp will be lit for you in the night until the sunlight shines forth on your breast. You shall be told, welcome, welcome. This is your house of the living. So you can see how they really made the afterlife so much akin to what we see and feel and taste right now. There's also a poem which survives from the ancient Egyptian times called A Man to His Bar. So the man is basically having a conversation with that part of his soul, if you like, or spirit. He's having an argument with him. Now, some people think it's a suicide note. Other people think this is the first philosophical piece of literature that we've actually seen. And when I read it, I think, actually, people probably would say this today. This is a quote. Hearts are greedy. Everyone robs his comrade's goods. Kindness is perished. Insolence assaults everyone. One is content with evil. So it's not really a happy man. And he describes death, therefore, like the fragrance of myrrh and like the fragrance of flowers he's basically adding. Coming on to the Ak. This is the bit that I think starts to stretch the mind for us a little bit, because this is a magical combination of the ka and the ba. And this could only happen if you had the proper funerary rites and everything went according to protocol. And the Ak lived among the stars, which is quite nice, and it could also help to reconnect with anyone you left behind at night during dreams. But crucially, it's not a ghost, because I'm coming on to that. That's the shahu, judge and spiritual body. That's the ghost. That's the bit that we would know. And if there was someone you didn't like, you'd send your ghost and they'd make trouble for them. If it's someone you did like, you'd be like, go on, help them out a bit, sweep up, do what you can do. And then finally, and this is the one we probably know least about, we've got the Sekhem, which is the life energy. And it's just another element of Ak. Interestingly, actually, when the Christians came to Egypt and they brought their own philosophy, the ancient Egyptians chose not to use the word ba to translate as soul, because they couldn't conceive of a soul being separate from a body, which of course in Christian theology you die and your soul goes off, but they were like, well, I don't understand that. So what they did was they took a different word. They took the Greek word psyche instead, because to them that just made a bit more sense. So talking about other cultures, it's fascinating, isn't it, that wherever you go there is some notion, some idea of a soul. I mean, even like, asking a few journalists, I said to them, you can leave it blank if you don't think we have a soul, but nobody did. So the ancient Chinese, very complicated culture, they thought there was a lower sensitive soul, which disappears when you die, so that's it, but also a rational principle, hun, it was called, which survives, and that was the object of ancestor worship, which you often hear a lot about. The early Hebrews didn't separate the concept of soul from body, so a bit like the ancient Egyptians, but the early Christians did. As I mentioned, they say you've got a split between body and soul, no soul without a body. The Greeks, interestingly for me, and when you read the book you'll know why I think it's interesting, because they thought, well, the Epicureans thought that the soul was made of atoms like the rest of the body. So when I'm trying to think, where is the body located? If it's made of atoms, well, that makes a little bit of a difference, doesn't it? But it did vary throughout the Greek times. So the Platonists said it was immaterial like the gods, yet part of the world. But Aristotle said, look, I'm not going to be able to separate the soul from the body. So there were arguments about it, even back then. Hinduism is very different. They had the Atman, which is the breath or soul, because they thought that was a kind of universal thing, and what the soul did was it kind of partook in it for a while, came out of it, partook of it, came out of it, so that's reincarnation. But I was quite surprised about Buddhism, because that negates the individual self. So what does that mean for soul? Does that mean you have a soul or not? Well, this is, according to the Gospel of Buddha, and it's a translation I found, so I can't, back it up, but it says this, from the Buddha, only through ignorance and delusion do men indulge in the dream that their souls are separate and self-existing entities. So because I work for the BBC, obviously I have to give you a little bit of BBC balance tonight. I'm not going to stand here and just talk about soul without giving the arguments against soul as well. And I've been looking around for them. It's quite interesting because a lot of them are just like, well, you can't prove it. Can't prove it either way, can you? So I wanted something a little bit more concrete than that to bring you, because my boss would not like it otherwise. So I bring you this, and an example of a railway foreman who lived in the 1800s. His name was Phineas Gage. If you're a little bit squeamish, you might want to cover your ears just for a little bit, because this is a bit gory, but I bring it to you for a reason. So in September the 13th, 1848, he had a horrific accident. What happened was, when he was at work, a tamping iron went right through his skull. It's amazing he survived if you think about it, especially, in those days when medicine wasn't quite so good. But it essentially entered under the left cheek and it exited the top of his skull. So it's sort of here. So what that means is like the frontal part of his brain was severely damaged. And then they found something really, really interesting. This guy, this Phineas, he'd been everyone's best mate, he'd been relaxed, he'd been charming, he'd been very diligent and very good at his job as well. He changed. Literally, as soon as he had the accident, he became aggressive, he became bad-tempered. Basically, women, you would not have wanted to be in a room alone. You're advised not to do that. So he completely changed. But philosophically, this posed a lot of problems for people, because they were still of the view, when the ancient Egyptians talked about personality being within the soul, they thought that was who you are. That is your essence, isn't it? It's kept in the soul. I don't know where it is, but it's in the soul. But of course, what happens if all the stuff that we attribute to the soul happens in the brain? And this got a lot of people talking, thinking about all of that and thinking, well, actually, maybe we're wrong, maybe. So when you do look online to find the counter-arguments, they essentially say we are a load of neural connections that happen in the brain and that soul instead. But I want to counter that again, because this is really nice. Have you heard of the experiment of Duncan MacDougall, right? So he lived in the 1900s, and on the 10th of April 1901, he did a very, very famous experiment, the 21 grams. There's even been a film which has been made about it. It was in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and he took 6 patients, and he got a set of Fairbanks weighing scales. And he basically took people he knew were going to die, okay? And I've seen the pictures, it's not actually very edifying. And he weighed them. He weighed them before and after, and he got it backed up by a load of other doctors who were in the room as well. And they took into account the air in their lungs and their bodily fluids and everything like that, and they found they lost 21 grams. Each and every one. So Duncan said, well, that's it. The soul must weigh 21 grams, mustn't it? It's proven. Some people say 6 people's not very much. And he wanted to know if animals have a soul as well. And I don't approve of this because apparently he killed the dogs. But he did an experiment on 15 dogs, and they didn't lose any weight at all. So he said, well, that proves it, doesn't it? Animals don't have souls, and humans do. He next tried to photograph the soul, and unfortunately he couldn't, so we don't have that, otherwise I'd show it to you. And he didn't do any other experiments. But people, of course, criticised what he did do. Physicist Augustus P. Clarke said, well, look, a sudden rise in body temperature is because the lungs are no longer cooling the blood as it pumps around, so you get a rise in sweating instead. So that's what's going on. And dogs don't have sweat glands. So I think he felt really pleased with himself. But I'm just going to leave that one with you, and I'm going to show you the newspaper article from the New York paper back in the day, because this is really nice. Imagine if this came out now. Soul has weight. Physicists think. We would definitely cover this on BBC Radio Kent, I have to say, because it's silly season at the moment, so we'd definitely do that. And it says that human soul has a definite weight which can be determined when it passes from the body is the belief of Dr. Duncan MacDougall, a reputable physician of Haverhill. He is at the head of a research society which for 6 years has been experimenting in this field. With him, he says, have been associated 4 other physicians. So it's up to you to decide whether you think that is true or not. And as a final point, because I know we're running out of time here, I want to bring you some food for thought courtesy of Dr. Nick Herbert. He's a physicist too. He says, science's biggest mystery is the nature of consciousness. It is not that we possess bad or imperfect theories of human awareness. We simply have no such theories at all.
And there was a story about an astronaut in space, and he just took all his gear off just to listen to the sound of the planets. And they were saying that basically it wasn't the planets making the sounds, it was in him.
Really?
His
That's
auditory system was
fascinating.
creating through the vibrations of the planets, but it was his auditory system that was creating the sounds. So I only got all that kind of like...
That's lovely. And do you know what? That's really interesting, because the main character in my book, Callie, in The Sound of Your Soul, kind of comes to those conclusions. So I mentioned it's about a relationship, and she's trying to fix somebody over here. And what she realises, actually, she's got to fix what's going on in here before she can fix what's going on with her husband. So that's the journey. And it's about, OK, if I over-focus on somebody else, I'm just going to get really petulant. I'm going to throw the toys out the pram. But if I make what's in here good, that gets reflected back at me via my husband, who is Simon. I won't tell you too much more about the plot, but yeah, it's got a lot to do with that.
What, a fictional husband?
Yeah. But my real husband is here as well. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, because I mean the arguments to say that we are just a brain are compelling. You know, the scientists have sat there and they've thought about it. But I guess empirically, within my own life and my own experiences, it doesn't seem to tally with all the magical experiences that I've had, and things that come to my brain that I couldn't have known. And then, of course, you hear about the transplants, don't you? And somebody getting somebody else's heart, and their complete personality changing or their accent changing, and you think, well, there's obviously more going on, isn't there? Like within the realm, and it's how you try and explain that. And what I've tried to do in the book is actually look at different religions and how they try and explain that journey and what that looks like to each of them, and bring them all together. So because God is banned in the book and you're not allowed to believe in God, what it does actually, counterproductively as far as the government are concerned, is it pulls everyone together. Because suddenly, the Christians who weren't talking to the Muslims, who weren't talking to the Buddhists, have something massive in common. They all want to believe something. So they hang out in the caverns below London. And fair play to my dad, who's here tonight, because he actually came into the sewers with me. We wore hard hats and suits, and we went down there to see what it was like, the Basil Jet Victorian sewers. Because I was like, well, if God is banned and you're scared to be found, where would you go? And they like it because it's this kind of analogy of going deep It's a bit like the ancient Egyptians went down at night into the underworld, and they went down and they kind of tried to evince what's really going on, and it sort of brought them all together in religious terms with exactly that sort of thing. There must be something else. We all understand it in different ways, but wouldn't it be more interesting if we spoke to each other and we had debates and discussions rather than saying, you're an outcast because I don't believe what you think. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting debates going on.
Looking at different perceptions of the soul in different cultures and so on, where they are not just one solid thing, so to speak, where they are, as for the Egyptians, split into multiple parts and so on. If that sort of can help us these days to understand ourselves and our psychology and
yeah, I think so. This is really interesting because I was watching a documentary about the ancient Egyptians the other day talking about their deities and the fact that they obviously didn't have the one God that we're quite used to in Western thought, and saying we've got it wrong. We seem to understand this is this person, this is that person, I worship you separately, but what they were saying, this is all part of the one consciousness, and these are sort of allegories for different ways the universe can manifest. And I guess it's the same with soul, isn't it? The more you split it down to realise that you're not one or the other of a person, that starts a journey within yourself, doesn't it? Because I think what we do psychologically is we put ourselves in boxes, and that really scuppers us because, like, well, Brexit is actually a good example. It's like, okay, well, I'm a Remainer or I'm a Brexiteer. So, yeah, BBC Balance, I have to use both examples. And I cannot listen to an argument that says anything different because that is who I am. Whereas we're multifaceted human beings, and you can take a bit of this and a bit of that and say, well, that's good about the EU and that's bad. Like nuance, basically. And I guess if you split yourself up into all these different parts, then you can understand. So let's just say, for example, for an ancient Egyptian person, like if you were going to fast, you might say, well, it's really holy to fast, I've got to fast. But actually the Ka dictates that that's part of your body that eats and drinks and does all the sort of human visceral stuff as well. So you would understand that part of you needs to be nourished as well, if that makes sense. It's a really good question. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I think it's that analogy example as well, and the complexities of us and the emotions that we go through, even within a single hour sometimes. You just need to cut yourself some slack sometimes, don't you, and say, I'm complicated, and that's okay.